Hello, and welcome to part two of this series of slide presentations about expressive slash symbolic slash conceptual portraiture. Boy, that's a mouthful. This particular slide presentation is about conceptual portraiture. Now, it is quite distinguished from expressive symbolic, maybe not in how it looks, but how it behaves. Conceptual portraiture and conceptual art itself is a bit challenging to wrap your head around, but I'm going to try to make it as concise and as easy for you to sort of grab hold of as possible, especially with some strong examples. What we're looking at now, I always like to go back historically when I get started on any slide presentation or any topic. We're looking at actually a very, very early photo. It was produced the same year that all of those different photographic processes were announced by Louis Daguerre and Henry Fox Talbot in 1839. So this is a very old photo. And I consider this the world's first conceptual photo. The title of this photo is Self-Portrait of the Artist as a Drowned Man. So it's essentially a portrait. The artist made a portrait of himself as a suicide victim. Well, of course, this would have not been possible if he had actually committed suicide. He is not drowned. He lived to have a long and productive life after this photograph was made. Yeah, you might think this is a little bit of an intense photo. It is. Hippolyte Bayard, but it was actually, this is the photographer here. Hippolyte Bayard was actually also a photographic inventor. He had a third process that he was preparing to announce, and he was discouraged by some friends of Daguerre's, and he ended up losing out in the game. So this was his ironic defeat of having his process demolished. It's a little bit of a morbid humor. But it also is the very first conceptual portrait that I know of. It really points to an aspect of photography that's both powerful and disturbing, and that is that things seem almost more real in photos than they would in real life. And we'll get to some other photographers who work on that level later. But one thing to point out about this, and this is really the heart of conceptual photography and art, is that the topic of this photograph, the idea of this photograph, the fact that it was made by a healthy man who lived a long life, and the title is Portrait of the Artist as a Drowned Man, that makes it a conceptual portrait. All of those things are more important than how good the photograph is, how it looks, how it's framed, how it's composed, all those fussy things that we normally worry about. And this is the mark of conception and conceptual work, is that the ideas trump or are as important or more important than the composition, design, light, etc. We'll take another example, look at another example. This is not much later than the Portrait of the Artist as a Drowned Man. This is another self-portrait, and this is by photographer Oscar Raylander, probably about 10 years after Hippolyte Bayard's photograph. And this title of this is Oscar Raylander, the Artist, introduces Oscar Raylander, the Volunteer. And these are, this is of course a montage. These are two separate photographs. He took at two different times, and then he montaged them together in the darkroom. You can actually see how kind of badly he did it up here. You could see the bringing together of the photos, which at the time was very, very nicely done. And of course, the thing is that it's not important how well or how badly this is done. The concept, the idea of him placing these two layers of his own personality photographically next to each other is really more important than how it's composed and how well it's made, any of those things. The idea, the concept is more important. Okay, let's move a little bit forward into the 20th century. And let's take a look at the work of a very interesting conceptual artist, Claude Cahun. Claude Cahun was an androgynous person. We were not using the they, them pronouns then, but she was born a woman, but she often took on either an androgynous or a male persona, depending on her mood. She felt very fluid about that. She was way ahead of her time, and she made a number of self-portraits that actually expressed the kind of containment she felt in the limitation of her sexual identification, or her gender identification, and also expressing when he, they, she were experimenting with other aspects of their personality. So this is one Claude Cahun within a bell jar. Here's a very interesting symbolic as well as conceptual portrait by Claude Cahun. It is a self-portrait. And of course, again, she's really addressing the multiple layers of multiple beings contained within one body. This is a later portrait, a more feminine portrait. Claude Cahun often would shave their head and really kind of strip down to this very androgynous character, which you see here. And again, this is a double exposure, a self-portrait with self-portrait. I don't know the story of this one, but I find it fascinating. And there's a number of portraits that Claude Cahun made that have this sense of imprisonment or yearning to get out. They are conceptual. Unlike, they might remind you of Francesca Woodman, who was very expressive. There is definitely an overlap here. But Claude Cahun was really more interested in the concept and the idea of her own entrapment. Cindy Sherman. Now, I'm going to go over this rather quickly because there will be a video for you to watch, an excerpt from Art 21, which is a very long expose on Cindy Sherman, because I think that her work especially is going to be very interesting to you, both in thinking about conceptual portraiture, but also about expressive portraiture and how to broaden our notion of what portraiture might mean. Cindy Sherman, very early on, began to experiment with self-portraiture, but in this case, she is never herself, and that's the ongoing idea of Cindy Sherman's work. She's always a character, and she's always a character that seems like something that you should know about, but which is really always entirely fictional. She made an early series called the Movie Stills, and these were all in black and white. Every one of them was Cindy Sherman. They all seem to be from a movie that you think you may have seen, but they actually are all very different. They're all fictional. They're all made up. They are all absolutely standalone. But we are invited to think about what may have happened or what may happen, and to imagine that we might have seen this somewhere else. I love this one because Cindy Sherman, one of the things I love about her is that she's very deliberately makes sure that you know she's making this fiction. And if you come down here to the right, you'll see that we can actually see the cord of the remote that she's using. She's not really trying to disguise that she's making a self-portrait. You'll see a lot more of this in the Art 21 video, but this is from her history series, where she actually, and these are all her, by the way, where she created these fictional historical paintings and photographed herself in these historical characters, which are not actually history. She'll talk about this one in the video, so I will leave those be for now. These are the history paintings in installation. One of the things about Cindy Sherman's work is it's very, very, the current work especially, is very oversized and very overwhelming. And it's something to think about in terms of fine artwork, is that we tend to look at work online these days, and of course we're going to look at a lot of work online, but really ultimately a lot of fine artwork needs to function in the physical realm. A few more Cindy Shermans. She'll talk about this series a bit in the video as well. And this series as well. And this series as well. So I'm going to leave those be, but just keep in mind that all of these are actually Cindy Sherman in costume and makeup. And they are photographed by Cindy Sherman. Okay. Here's a really interesting conceptual series that dates back to I believe it's the 70s, an earlier, slightly earlier one. This is by Ralph Eugene Meatyard, who's one of my favorite photographers, and he did a number of different things. But his final group of photographs was called the Lucy Bell Crater series, and this is a conceptual portrait series about the nature of identity. So this is the form in which they're supposed to be shown, and forgive me for the bad rephotographed image from a book. I didn't get this quite right. But I want to read the title out loud. So you see these two women who are standing, it's a very snapshotty photo, standing in front of a house, and they're both wearing these very grotesque masks, and the masks are important. The title says Lucy Bell Crater and her charming youthful mother-in-law, apostrophe, or excuse me, comma, Lucy Bell Crater. So Lucy Bell Crater is the character of every single person in every single photo here. So any of these photos, the title would say Lucy Bell Crater and his beautiful wife, Lucy Bell Crater. Same here, Lucy Bell Crater and her adorable grandson, Lucy Bell Crater. Lucy Bell Crater and her husband in front of their beautiful car. Her husband, Lucy Bell Crater. Excuse me, I need to put that in there. Okay. Now, going in a completely different direction, this is the work of Ana Mendieta. She was a Cuban artist. Unfortunately, she died quite young, very likely by suicide, although it's not absolutely certain. And Ana Mendieta was both a land artist and considered a photographer and a filmmaker. So she would make these land-based self-portraits, which often appear to be like burials, and then document them. And the documentation was the work. I'll show you some individual versions of these. So again, conceptually, the concept of how these are made is more important than the absolute beauty or compositional or technical finesse of the photos. It is the idea of it. This is one that I loved where she actually laid down in the grass and or dug up this grass and laid down in it and then came back later when it was just starting to grow back. So you just see the outline of the memory of her body there. Sometimes she would actually physically be present in these photos, usually not. Okay. Now, this is Anne Hamilton. Anne Hamilton is a conceptual artist who sometimes works in film and photography and video. This particular series that I want to show you is a conceptual series that she did making portraits with her mouth. So she made a pinhole camera, which is a tiny little film camera, that she made small enough that she could put it inside of her mouth. So this is actually a photograph of Anne Hamilton with the pinhole camera in her mouth. This means that she's looking and seeing with her mouth rather than her eyes. The thing that you usually speak with, she sees with. And this is what the photographs look like. Now again, the quality or the aesthetic composition of these photographs is not what's important. What's important is how they were made, the concept of how they were made. I'm particularly fond of the ones where we are really conscious that we are looking through her lips and out into the world. We can look at somebody with our mouths, but we're unable to speak to them while we're looking. This is her son, Emmett. So whoever she's photographing can talk, but she cannot. She must be mute. All right. Next one is Jim Goldberg. Now, Jim Goldberg also has an incredible range of photos, but he is maybe got most famous initially for this series called Rich and Poor. He made Polaroid portraits of people and then had them write their own captions on the portrait. So if you can't read it, I'll go ahead and read this for you. This young woman says, "This picture does not reflect my personality. I am not an empty person. I have a lot of feelings and stand up for what I think." In this one, and the last one, of course, was a quite wealthy person. Here is someone who is less means, and what it says is, "What I really want is a real home with nice furniture, also a van to drive. I would also like to uh, to um, to something my son. Oh, I can't do it. To give my son what I didn't get in life, which included love." This one is really my favorite. The woman is written here. "Edgar looks splendid here. His power and strength of character come through. He is a very private person who is not demonstrative of his affections. That has never made me unhappy. I accept him as he is. We were totally devoted to each other. May you be as lucky in marriage, Jim." Up at the top, he says, "My wife is acceptable. Our relationship is satisfactory." I'm just going to let you read that on your own. All right, this is a very interesting artist that I'm relatively new to, and I am blanking on her name. And you know I do this all the time in class, so I'm going to just leave it here. She is an artist of mixed race. Has African blood. She lives in the part of the world which is very, very white, and she made these photos to talk about the idea of the identity, the pride of the identity of white people, and her discomfort with that dichotomy, with the way that she has had to um, live between her identity as someone of Scotch heritage and someone with African heritage. And so these are all self-portraits. These are photoshopped. Every face in her here is her as this character that she feels like she needs to pretend to be, or other people project upon her. Okay. And I believe this is the last. I'm going to get it in here in under 20 minutes, which is a struggle with conceptual. It's a pretty intense subject. This is Rineke Dijkstra, one of my very favorite contemporary photographers, and primarily a portrait photographer. Her portraits are always conceptual. That is, that she works from a place where the circumstances surrounding the portraits are as important as the portraits themselves. In this series, she went to the beach and photographed adolescents on the beach, a place which makes them very exposed and vulnerable. This is also a typology, that is, she's collecting a number of photos of the same type of person in the same setting, so that we experience both the sameness and the difference. So she's really interested in that kind of vulnerability, but also that comparison. Here's some of the individual ones. Okay, a few more of these that are even more obviously conceptual. This is a series of photos that she did of bullfighters. She always photographed them within 10 minutes of coming out of the ring, no matter what had happened to them. She's interested in these moments that are very fleeting, very vulnerable, the things that we don't usually photograph, we usually photograph the midst of it or the triumph of it, and so this is this aftermath. And here's some of the individual ones. This is another series, and of course, this is not something that's possible within the scope of this class, but I wanted to show you a couple of these time-based series where she goes back and photographs the same person in a similar setting every year in most cases. I think this one is every year or every 2 years. This is probably one of my favorite of her series, and I'll leave you with this. I think this is the last in this slideshow. This is a young man who enlisted in the Foreign Legion, and she photographed him every 6 months, I believe it was, after his enlistment, and showed these dramatic changes from on the upper left when he enlisted, and I believe it is 2 or 3 years later on the lower right. Let's just take a look at that transformation. And again, not something you can do within the scope of this class, but just to give you a sense of where conceptual portraiture could go. Okay. Oh, one last one. Very quick. This is a series that she made of women within an hour of giving birth. I find this one really moving and intense. Again, notice that the aesthetic qualities are not what's important here. What's important is the collection of this specific conceptual moment. And the awkwardness is even part of what makes these extraordinary and moving. Okay, I've gone a couple of minutes over time. Please forgive me. It's an important topic. Take a break, and when you're ready, come back and take a look at some examples of student projects.